Throughout biblical history, you learn some very interesting things. If you start, like let's say, at Genesis and work your way through and keep certain themes in mind, you can find recurring themes all throughout the Bible. And some of these are really fascinating, and there are many of them. And one of them is God's plan of redemption for humanity. Now, what's interesting about this? Well, what's interesting about it is he kept his plan secret all the way up. I could be mistaken about this, but you can make an argument for it. Until the Roman centurion saw Jesus down on the cross and said that he was the Messiah. He might have been the first person that actually understood God's message, that this was God's plan. There were many people, both righteous and unrighteous in the Old Testament, who wanted to know what God was doing. And God gave them answers, but he never gave them the full and complete answer. Even John the Baptist didn't entirely have an answer. He didn't fully understand. We are living past that age now, which I would call the end times, but some would call the church age, same thing, I guess. But where we can look back at that time period now. Now, one of the people who really wanted to know an answer for what all of this is was Solomon, King Solomon. And he went to God for wisdom. Now, the Bible says that if you want wisdom, God gives it abundantly. So why don't more people do this? Well, I think the reason more people don't do it is because, one, they don't really understand the availability issue that the Bible's talking about. But two, the Bible warns not to do this with doubting. Because if you do this with doubting, you're going to have internal conflict. So you can't even make up your mind about what you're experiencing and what you're observing. Another issue is this. Sometimes we hear the truth and we don't like it. And you have to be someone who's looking for the truth. Solomon is described best this way. He was someone who wanted to know answers. Let me give you an illustration from my own life. And maybe this can speak to you a little bit if you're not familiar with these themes. When I was in high school, I went to, as I mentioned earlier, a football school. There's an old movie or TV show called Friday Night Lights. I've never seen it, but I heard that name, was like, that's interesting. Because I remember I would be sitting there. I've always been kind of a philosopher my whole life. And I'd be sitting there with people, having a good time. Always tons of people at these football games. But inevitably, and where I live in Kentucky, even in a city like Louisville, you can see trees in the background at high school football games. And this happened frequently, where I would look up at the lights and I would see the trees. And here I was, very young in my teens. And I would just think to myself, what is all this? Does somebody out there get this? What is this? What's the point of all this? What does it all mean? There's got to be something to this. Does somebody understand? Solomon had this exact same question. Now, there are several things for you to understand where Solomon's coming from on this. The first thing you have to understand is Solomon, he's not rejecting the truth. Okay, he's going to accept reality for what it is. This is why I often make a case that the Bible doesn't fit into our matrix for what qualifies as a religion. We see religion as you can create a loophole to get out of a problem. You can identify a sin and then say, okay, well, if I do this, I overcome the sin, or the sin is overcome. And a lot of times when I hear people talk about religion, it's happened in one of two ways. Either it's some kind of formal structure, which the Bible doesn't really offer a lot of, to be totally honest with you. There's some of that in there, or it is someone who's actually looking for answers. And so if religion can be known as looking for answers, then Solomon would fit that perfect. Okay, back to what I was saying. So several things you have to understand about Solomon. The first is this. He's looking at life and looking at the cyclical nature of the world. Okay, that's one thing he's looking at. He's also looking at fulfillment and gratification in life. That's the second thing we're going to consider. And the third thing he's going to consider is wisdom itself. This is Ecclesiastes 1 through 18, by the way, if you're interested in reading it yourself. But I think better for most viewers to just hear this sort of packaged as a story, because I think it's more interesting for many people that way. And sometimes when you get into the technical roots, it's difficult to understand some of these things. But in these verses, Solomon has asked God for wisdom already, okay? And God has already made him, by many, considered the wisest man on earth. And there are different passages in the Bible that demonstrate this. But if he is the wisest man on earth, we have writings there that you can figure that out for yourself. Do you agree? Read it yourself. And the first thing he notices is, and this is where you start to get away from organized religious ideas here. He looks at the world and he looks at the cyclical nature. And in the cyclical nature of the world, he says, this is meaningless. Everything under the sun is vanity of vanities, is the way he puts it. What's he mean by this? He's saying, look at generations. What defines a generation? Those who live within it, right? They're born, they live within it, and then they die. And he says, you look at the past, nothing ever changes. You look at the present, nothing ever changes. And what do you think is going to happen in the future? Nothing's going to change. It's cyclical, it's meaningless. Whatever is meaningful in this generation is going to be just as meaningful in the next, and is just as meaningful as the one before it. This is a pretty depressing message, right? I mean, he's just, look, there's just no meaning to any of this. That's the first order of wisdom he brings up in Ecclesiastes. It's just repetitive. He uses the sun as an example. It rises, it sets, and guess what? It rises again, and that's it. You can try to paste any meaning you want onto it, but exactly what fulfillment will that give you? And that leads us on to the next part of what he's discussing. He says the eye can never take in enough and the ear can never fully hear. And what he's talking about here is that life, he says what's been broken cannot be unbroken. And this idea that life leaves us with this sort of dissatisfaction. That no matter what we experience, you can have some real highs. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, have some real lows. And then there are things that once they alter, they're altered forever. And he says, among these two things, exactly where is a meaning going to arrive? I apologize if I've told this story before, but it fits this so perfect. And I do like the story. And I'll keep it brief in case I've told it in an earlier video. But I was at my stepmother's house, and she's very gifted when it comes to creating like these sort of Southern style and country style decorations for her house. She's been in magazines actually, and she had this collage of black and white photos. And I said, "Oh, where'd you get those?" And she said, "I got them at a yard sale." And I was like, "Huh?" And she said, "I got a basket full of them." So I went and I got in the basket. And it was like depressing. It's depressing because these pictures aren't like for you and me. I can just set up my camera and post a video for anyone to see anytime, and it can be about just about anything. It can even be about toilet paper. That's a little shout out to David T. But there's this pictures are just a dime a dozen now, right? They're nothing special anymore. But at this time, it was an effort to make a picture, and you took a picture for the exact purposes of posterity. You took a picture so future generations could remember. And now these pictures are being sold at a yard sale because no one knows who these people are. So you don't even find meaning in memories, right? It's just it all. Now, I warn people not to take Solomon too literal here. He's not saying, because he says there's nothing new, right? Nothing new under the sun is what he says. Very famous statement. He is not saying that no one's done anything different ever. That's not what he's saying. It's in regard to under the sun being meaningful. There's nothing new. There's nothing you can find that's going to give your life meaning, nor your death. No matter what cause you think is so great that you're going to fight for, in the end, you're going to die, and people will forget it, and it'll change too. Your cause will disappear one day. You look at the story of Titanic. I love the story of Titanic. And I was just thinking about the other day that it must have been so devastating at the time, people probably thought, wow, that this is just amazing. And we can't feel half of what they felt at that time. And they said within a decade from now, the entire ship is probably going to be gone because it's corroding so bad. And they're like, we have to preserve it. And I'm thinking, what difference does it make? The memory will go away whether the ship goes away or not. But even if it didn't, the meaningfulness won't be there. There's no meaning beyond it. Okay, I want to hype that point too much, but that's really what Solomon gets to. And then finally, Solomon gets to the end and he looks at wisdom itself and he says, you know what happens when you gain knowledge? You just get sad. It just makes you sad. The more wisdom you gain, the sadder you get, because you see that you learn that life is ultimately vapid and pointless. I don't know what the title of this, maybe Depression Time, but it's a grim outlook on life. This is what Solomon says God showed him through wisdom. This grim view of the world. Now, I'm looking at this through the guise of the New Testament. And what do we see? So this cyclical nature, generation after generation, has God done anything with that? Well, actually, he has. The resurrection of Jesus shows that curse has been reversed. That there can be eternal life for those who believe. And so they are not stuck into. So Solomon's wisdom is still true, but it wasn't the complete picture. Why? Because God had not revealed the complete picture yet. Okay? So Jesus reversed that issue. What about finding fulfillment and gratification? Jesus was dealing with these people who had suffered from false teachers. And they had become poor. They had lost all their faith. Some of them had wrecked lives because they put so much trust in these false teachers. And in John 10:10, he says this. It's a little bit more expansive than this, but he says, I have come to bring them life and give it to them more abundantly. He wants them to have fulfillment in life. This, to me, in my personal opinions, this goes beyond the religiosity that's defined by our secular days. The sort of our ethos of secularism that we have, where we look at religion as just a series of, crossing T's and dotting I's. In this particular case, Jesus is saying he's going to give you a life that gives you actual fulfillment. Again, the wisdom of Solomon is not the final say as far as God is concerned. He has even reversed that, where an abundant life can be had just by knowing the person of Christ. Me and many people I know would attest to this, that my life was meaningless until I found him. And then everything changed. And have found meaning. Have I found perfection in this life? No. But the Bible tells us that won't happen either. But I have found a more abundant life. For sure. It's not even in question. Maybe one day I can talk about that. And then finally, in wisdom itself. In wisdom itself, there's a sadness. But in the resurrection of Christ, the sadness isn't the final say. The final say is joy. That is actually the final say. Okay, hope you enjoyed this. Read Ecclesiastes if you've never read it. It is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating and worth your time. Have a good one.